I'm not usually the type to spend time on adult websites, but one random night in July, I found myself doing exactly that. Somehow, I not only ended up browsing through one but also actually paying for their premium membership. At the time, I thought, hey, $100 isn't too steep. I was watching this live stream with a woman who was captivating, to say the least. Sure, I'd seen shows that were a lot more impressive, but something about this one really struck me. The model went by Hot Housewife Emma. But here's the kicker, I recognized her. That was no Emma. That was my wife, Loren. In the heat of their session, her partner, this smug guy, leaned back and gave her this cocky look. Well, darling, he said, that was something. I bet your husband can't make you feel this way? Huh. Without missing a beat, Loren flashed him a playful smile and replied, well, Marco, it was fun, but no one sets me on fire like my husband does. I've been with a few men, but none of them make me as happy as he does. You're good, but he's amazing. So keep trying. Marco looked genuinely confused and asked, if he's so great, why are you here cheating on him? But Loren just kept smiling and said, I didn't plan this, but I enjoy the thrill. I'm glad you're part of it. Besides, I can get away with it. He'll never find out. I love my husband with all my heart. It makes me appreciate him even more. That $100 turned out to be worth every cent because I found out the truth right there, without needing any private investigator. Now, you're probably wondering how I even ended up on that site in the first place. Fair question. Truth is, it was just a strange twist of fate. Not exactly lucky that Loren was with Marco, but lucky I stumbled across it and learned the truth. Loren and I had been married for over 8 years. We'd known each other practically our whole lives. We both grew up in the same small town in central Illinois. She lived in town and I was raised out in the countryside. Her dad owned the biggest grain elevator in the area, and my dad managed the largest grain farm, so our families were bound to cross paths. Naturally, we became friends, went to school together, and grew up side by side. I'll skip the childhood crushes and college dating stories. Let's just say we both saw other people along the way. But deep down, I think we both knew we'd end up together. I was her first, but we both had others before we finally made things official. Junior year at the University of Illinois, we decided to be exclusive, and a year and a half later, right after we graduated, we got married. We both finished with business degrees, and life felt pretty great. At least, that's what I thought until that night 3 years ago. Since then, a lot's happened. Loren's parents retired and moved to Phoenix, Arizona. Loren and her siblings, her sister Mia and her brothers, Ted and Evan, bought 48% of their dad's grain business. He kept control at first to help them out financially, but eventually he let them take full ownership. And Mia? She ended up marrying a friend of mine, Max Bennett, another guy in the grain business. Max manages his own farm, just a bit smaller than mine, and since we live nearby, we end up hanging out pretty often. As for the family business, Ted and Evan run the grain operations, while Loren handles all the financial stuff. Her sister Mia is there too, handling customer relations and managing grain sales. It's a tight-knit, family-run setup, with a few extra hands brought on seasonally to help with trucking and grain handling during the busy times. Anyway, enough backstory. Let's talk about how I caught my wife with another man online and everything that happened after. To start, Loren and her siblings had been busting their backs to finalize the grain business deal. I wasn't deeply involved, but I knew they'd been juggling meetings with banks, the Illinois Department of Agriculture, insurance folks, you name it. By the end, they were totally wiped out. Luckily, this all happened over winter, which is their slow season. For me, it was right after harvest, so I didn't need Loren's help on the farm as much. She doesn't usually help with the physical labor, but with 200 acres of corn and soybeans to manage, I count on her for errands and odd tasks to keep things running. With everything winding down, Loren and Mia decided to treat themselves to a few days at a spa. They booked a 3-night stay, came back refreshed, and enjoyed it so much that they planned another spa weekend for July, right after planting season. Little did I know, this trip would be what tipped me off to everything. One afternoon, Daniel Stone, a friend from college and an agent with the Illinois Department of Agriculture, stopped by for a routine visit. When he asked about Loren, I mentioned she was off on a spa trip. He gave me a funny look and hinted there might be something fishy going on there. Apparently, his cousin worked as a masseuse at the spa and had heard some wild rumors about the place. Before he left, he suggested I take a look online, just to see what I might find. So, that evening, out of sheer curiosity, I decided to check it out. After a bit of browsing, I found the spa's site, complete with a live feed, and clicked in. And that's when the real show began. I could go into detail about what I saw, but what's the point? That night was a whirlwind of emotions. Hurt, anger, disbelief, the works. Finding out your spouse has been unfaithful is devastating enough, but I was about to learn it wasn't her first time. See, the spa's website had an archive section. Thanks to my premium membership, I was able to access videos from Loren and Mia's earlier trips, as well as the 2 nights they just spent there. For an extra $20 per video, I downloaded 8 in total, adding $160 to the initial $100 I'd spent. So, for $260, I had all the evidence I needed to file for divorce. I hadn't fully figured out my plan yet, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to sit around. I didn't want to drag things out for a month, 2 weeks, or even a week. The sooner we separated, the better. Now, with this video proof, I could make my move. It turned out Loren had been with another man at least 8 different times. Actually, 2 men, Marco and Steve, if the videos I downloaded were anything to go by. Whether or not there had been others didn't matter to me. 2 was more than enough to prove what I needed. I burned several DVD copies of the videos and stashed them securely. My father had built this house, and he'd installed a wall safe behind a hidden panel in his office bookshelf. I locked the DVDs up there, then went through my computer and erased every trace of the spa website, deleting the original files. Now, with those DVD copies safely tucked away, I'd removed all evidence from my computer. Once everything was in order, I picked up my phone and shot Loren a text. Loren, this is William. I know exactly what you've been doing at the spa, and I have the proof. Don't bother coming back to the house. It's no longer your home, and soon I won't be your husband. We're done. My lawyer will contact you in the next few days. We'll arrange for you to collect your belongings. It seemed her phone was off because I didn't get any response that night. But the next morning, my phone started ringing, and there it was, Lauren's name on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message, she sounded frantic. William, what on earth are you talking about? I don't understand any of this. Mia and I are packing up now, and we'll be home in a couple of hours. Whatever you think I did, you're wrong. Let's talk when I get back. I love you, William. Then she called again, leaving almost the exact same message. It was like she'd rehearsed what to say when she realized I wasn't going to pick up. After that, she sent me a text repeating more of the same, but I wasn't in the mood for a back and forth with her. I sent her one last message. Why don't you ask Marco if he has any idea what I'm talking about? Maybe he can give you a little more insight. And as for coming back to the house, don't. Sover, Loren. That must have stopped her in her tracks because I didn't hear from her again that day. But by afternoon, she'd called once more and left a voicemail. William, we need to talk. I'm staying with Mia until we can sit down and clear up this huge misunderstanding. Please call me. The next morning, I went straight to my bank and set up a second safe deposit box in my name only. I stored a copy of the DVDs and the original prenuptial agreement there, just in case. I also made a spare copy of the prenup and kept it with me. By 11 a.m., I was sitting across from my lawyer, ready to get this thing moving. While I was pretty sure my lawyer already had a copy of all my documents, I wasn't about to leave anything to chance. But when I arrived at his office, I was caught off guard. Loren was already there, looking a mess. Her hair was all over the place, her eyes red and puffy from crying. William, we need to talk this through, she said, her voice shaky. I raised an eyebrow and asked, how'd you even know I had an appointment here? She sighed and replied, Julian called me when you set it up. Right then, Julian Monroe, my lawyer, stepped out and invited both of us to come into his office. My anger simmered, barely held back, and I snapped, no, Julian, we're not going into your office together. Your call to Loren has destroyed my trust in you. I need an answer right now. Will you represent me and only me? Julian, who I'd always thought of as a sharp guy, looked a bit clueless and said, no, William. If this continues, I'll be representing Loren. It was obvious he saw the grain business with Lauren's family as a more lucrative client than my own farm. And apparently the Gentry family held more appeal for him. Fine, Julian, I said, my voice ice cold. Make sure every original document and copy of my contracts and paperwork are ready by 4 p.m. today. I'll either pick them up myself or send a courier. I've appreciated your work in the past, but you're making a big mistake here. My new attorney will be in touch soon. Loren stood there silently as I spoke, but then she couldn't hold back. William, why won't you just talk to me now? Let's clear this up. Because, Loren, I replied calmly, it's obvious Julian values you more as a client than he does me. I won't engage in this without a lawyer I trust. Julian jumped in, looking hurt. William, you know I've always been upfront with you. You have nothing to worry about. In my mind, I thought, oh, Julian, I've got plenty to worry about. You can't serve two masters and you've made your choice. I gave him one last look and said, goodbye. My new attorney will be in touch. I walked out, hearing Loren break down in tears again as I left. Now I had to find a new lawyer, fast. I knew Samuel Mitchell by reputation, a sharp attorney with a serious competitive streak against Julian Monroe. He'd be a good option, but I didn't want to rush into hiring him without doing my due diligence. You don't take chances with lawyers, bankers, or accountants. They handle your most private business, and you've got to be careful. Since I knew a few folks who had worked with Samuel before, I decided to call his office and ask for references. The secretary, who introduced herself as Isabel, was more than happy to send me a list. When I looked it over, I saw a few familiar names on there, including for friends. I figured I'd visit 3 of them and get some first-hand advice before making my decision. It didn't take long to get the feedback I needed. Each of my 3 friends gave glowing recommendations for Samuel's work. I skipped asking my 4th friend, Max, since he was married to Mia, Lauren's sister, and I wanted to keep him out of this. Feeling confident, I called Samuel's office back, introduced myself, and asked for an appointment sometime after 4 p.m. The receptionist, who I now knew as Isabel, checked the schedule and said he was booked until 4:30 but might be able to fit me in. After a brief hold, she came back on the line and confirmed he could meet with me at 4:30 for a short consultation. I agreed, mentioning I'd probably arrive a bit early. At 4 o'clock sharp, I swung by Julian's office to pick up my paperwork. Unsurprisingly, they were still copying everything. I could tell they were stalling, probably hoping I'd have a change of heart. Growing frustrated, I insisted they wrap it up within 15 minutes, or I'd have my new attorney reach out. When they asked who it was, I just replied, "You'll find out soon enough." That seemed to light a fire under them. 20 minutes later, I had my documents in hand. I arrived at Samuel's office on time, and we had a quick but efficient meeting. He agreed to take me on as both my personal and business attorney, and when I asked if I could leave my paperwork with him for safekeeping, he assured me it'd be secure in his office vault. We scheduled a longer meeting for the next morning to go over everything and begin planning my divorce case. As I was leaving, Isabel smiled and asked if she'd held me up from any other evening plans. I laughed and said, "Not at all, Isabel. Everything's moving along just fine." The following morning, Samuel and I met up to review my business documents. I can't share details because of attorney-client privilege, but Samuel assured me everything looked in order. We broke for lunch, and Samuel and Isabel invited me to join them at a local diner. Sounded nice, so I agreed, planning to swing by the bank afterward. Lunch was a pleasant surprise. I got to know more about them. Samuel and Isabel had been married for 10 years and had 2 young daughters. They showed me some photos of the girls. Adorable kids with Isabel's warm smile. It was good to feel at ease with my new attorney, but seeing their easy, affectionate dynamic was bittersweet. It reminded me of what I'd had with Loren once, and I found myself tearing up a couple of times. Samuel seemed focused on lunch and didn't notice, but I caught a concerned look from Isabel. After lunch, I headed to the bank, secured my assets, and arranged a $5,000 check to the Samuel Mitchell Law offices as a retainer. He hadn't requested it yet, but I thought it was a solid gesture to show I meant business. When I got back to the office, ready to continue, Isabel greeted me and let me know Samuel was on a call. She led me into a small conference room and asked if I'd like some coffee, but I declined. After a moment, she sat beside me, a gentle look in her eyes, and said, "William, Samuel hasn't shared specifics, but I can sense this is about your wife. If you don't mind, I'd like to sit in on your meeting this afternoon. Sometimes, having a woman's perspective can make a difference." I was already feeling close to the edge, and her offer of support nearly undid me. I nodded, grateful for her understanding, and began telling her the painful story of how I'd uncovered Lauren's infidelity. I broke down a few times while recounting it, and Isabel offered a quiet, steadying presence, her sympathy evident. Once I managed to pull myself together, I made my intentions clear. Unless something significant changed, I planned to move forward with the divorce and enforce the terms of our prenuptial agreement. Samuel joined us shortly after, and we reviewed the prenup in detail. The terms were straightforward. If Loren was faithful, she'd be entitled to half of our shared financial assets. But if infidelity was proven, she'd only receive $25,000 for each year of our marriage, and I'd get $225,000 per year instead of splitting everything 50-50ths. As for our assets, I'd retain 100% ownership of all farm assets, real estate, and personal property, while Loren would keep her full share of the grain business assets. Samuel asked if I had evidence of the infidelity, and I told him I did but wasn't willing to show it unless absolutely necessary in court. I emphasized I didn't want anyone else to have to see what I'd seen unless it was critical. Isabel, who had been listening silently, placed a hand on Samuel's arm and nodded her agreement. Reluctantly, Samuel accepted my choice, understanding my need for discretion. In the days that followed, Loren called repeatedly and left message after message, but I refused to answer or listen to any of them. Then Samuel informed me that a meeting was scheduled for Thursday with Loren, Julian, Samuel, and me. I was determined to confront her with some key questions, and her answers would decide if I'd go through with the divorce and on what terms. On Thursday at 10:30 a.m., Samuel and I arrived at Julian's office. Lauren's car was already in the parking lot. We were shown into a small conference room, where we waited a few minutes until Julian and Loren joined us. Loren had clearly made an effort to look put together. She looked much better than she had earlier in the week. She managed to smile and said, "William, I hope we can finally talk and clear up this misunderstanding. I miss you and want to come home." I didn't respond, afraid that my voice would betray my emotions. Samuel took the lead, saying, "We're here to discuss the matters at hand." Samuel began by explaining, "Today, we're here to discuss the divorce process for William and Loren. Both of you should have the chance to express your thoughts on how to move forward." Julian jumped in, adding, "My client believes this is all a big misunderstanding and is eager to work things out with her husband." My anger, which had been simmering just below the surface, flared up at that. Oddly enough, it helped me keep control. It sharpened my focus, making it easier to confront the hurt and disappointment I felt toward Loren. "That works for me, Julian," I replied. "Your client can talk directly to her husband." Turning to Loren, I continued, "Let's lay out the facts. When we got married, we signed a prenuptial agreement, which we updated 2 years ago when you joined your father's business. I've brought copies of that updated agreement for everyone." Loren looked a bit stunned, but she kept quiet. I continued, "Our goal was to protect our individual interests while enjoying the benefits of our marriage. The original agreement was primarily to safeguard assets in my family, which go back generations. When you joined your father's business, we also wanted to protect your family's assets." I could see her expression tighten as she took in my words, but I pressed on. "In the event of a divorce, the agreement is straightforward. I keep 100% of my family's assets, and you keep 100% of your family's assets. Any debts related to those assets also remain with the respective business. Personal items like clothing, jewelry, and your car are yours and mine are mine. Household property is split evenly, but farm property, like the grain bins and machinery, remains entirely with me." I paused to give her a moment before moving on. "In terms of financial division, if we divorce with no infidelity involved, you'd be entitled to half of our joint assets. However, if infidelity is proven, the terms change. Under those conditions, I would receive $225,000 per year instead of splitting everything 50-50ths. Taking a deep breath, I asked Loren, I'm going to ask you some direct questions. How you answer will determine whether I proceed with the divorce and on what grounds. This will also affect any financial settlements. If you're serious about saving our marriage, you need to be completely honest. If you lie or refuse to answer, then it's over. Do you understand? And are you willing to do this? Loren looked shocked by the terms of the prenuptial agreement but quickly pulled herself together. Yes, William, she said, sounding resolved. I'll answer your questions truthfully. I love you, and I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right and come back home. Loren, I said, I'd like to record your answers, if that's all right with you. She hesitated, glancing over at Julian, who had stayed mostly quiet up to that point. Julian, looking like the typical cautious lawyer, finally spoke up. Loren, I'd advise against recording anything, but ultimately, it's up to you. Samuel added, I agree with Julian. I wouldn't recommend recording this conversation. Samuel glanced over at Loren and said, It's William you need to convince here, not us. Do what feels right to you. Loren nodded and replied, I'll do anything to fix this. Yes, go ahead and record it. I'm okay with it. Samuel and I set up a small recorder on the table, and once everything was ready, Loren looked at me and asked, What do you want to know? I told her I wanted to cover her faithfulness across 3 time periods, starting with the time from when we first committed to each other exclusively until our engagement. I asked, During that time, were you faithful? She gave a small, confident smile and said, Yes, I was, but I saw through it immediately. That's lie number 1, I replied flatly, watching her smile disappear. I told her I'd almost walked out then and there but had decided to stay for the sake of getting everything out in the open. I reminded her of a particular encounter with Louis Fairbanks. Just 2 days after we'd promised exclusivity, Louis had boasted about spending time with her while her parents were away, getting intimate in her bedroom. Mia, who'd overheard him bragging, had reassured me at the time, insisting that Loren loved me and wouldn't cheat again, urging me not to act rashly. Though I was furious, I'd let it slide that once, but I had warned Loren there'd be no second chances. She had to be honest from then on. I explained to Loren that the incident with Louis had made me cautious. I kept a close eye on her for 6 months. When she didn't raise any red flags, I finally proposed and gave her the engagement ring she still wore. I admitted that maybe she had wanted the proposal sooner, but I hadn't been ready to trust completely, so I'd made her wait. Next, I asked if she had been faithful from the time of our engagement until the day we married. Without a moment's hesitation, she replied, No, absolutely not. I didn't cheat on you. I'd expected this answer, and for once, I believed it was true. But I told her that, even then, I'd still kept a close watch on her until I was confident she'd earned my trust. Julian noticed Loren was struggling emotionally. Her face was tense, her eyes glossy, and he suggested we take a break so he could speak with her privately. I agreed, as both Samuel and I could see she was on the verge of breaking down. We decided to break for lunch. Samuel, Isabel, and I headed out to a nearby diner, and over the Blue Plate special, Isabel gently asked how things were going. Samuel filled her in, saying, William's holding up well. He's been setting up the ground rules for honest answers about their marriage. If Loren confesses everything, he might still go through with the divorce, but he also knows she wants to fix things. It's a tough spot, but William can handle it. But if she lies, Samuel trailed off, leaving the implications clear. Isabel looked over at me, sensing the weight I was carrying. I managed a weak smile and said, This is incredibly hard. Why do people make choices that end up hurting not just themselves, but everyone they care about? She placed a comforting hand on mine and replied, If only we could see the consequences clearly, William. Maybe we could give them a reality check before it ever came to this. Isabel's comment about foolish choices actually got a laugh out of me, and Samuel chuckled too. Even in moments like this, it felt good to find a little humor. I guess it's a testament to human resilience. People grieve at funerals but can still share a laugh in the middle of it all. I suppose it's the same with divorce. Even in the pain, there's sometimes a moment of lightness. I looked over at Isabel with a grin and said, "Thanks, Isabel. I really needed that." She nodded and smiled warmly back. Around 1 p.m., we returned to Julian's office to continue. Before asking my next question, I reminded Loren, "You need to be completely honest with these answers. If you lie, this meeting is over, and so is any hope for our marriage. Do you understand?" Loren nodded, looking serious. "Yes, I understand. I'll tell you the truth." Taking a deep breath, I asked, "Since the day we got married, have you ever cheated on me?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and I felt a pang of sympathy. I knew this was hard for her, but if she cared about our marriage, she needed to confess. I didn't know if I could avoid a divorce, but if she told me the full truth, maybe it would mean she genuinely wanted to save what we had. After a pause, she whispered, "Yes, William. I did cheat on you. I'm so sorry, William. Can you ever forgive me?" I asked Julian and Samuel to leave the room. I had more questions for Loren, and I wanted to give her some privacy. Both lawyers objected, but I insisted, and Loren nodded at Julian, signaling she wanted him to leave too. I already had her confession on tape, enough for any divorce hearing. But I didn't want the rest of our conversation recorded, so I turned the tape recorder off. "Loren," I said gently, "I need to know when, where, who, and why." She sniffled, clearly struggling, and then began, "Oh, William, I'm so sorry. It happened just this weekend at the spa. I was unfaithful with one of the masseurs named Marco. I don't know why it happened, William. It was just this moment of passion." She paused, tears spilling over, and continued, "Mia and I had had such a good day. After a nice dinner, we decided to get massages before bed. My masseur was Marco. I was lying there on my stomach, and his hands were so strong and gentle. I didn't stop him. I didn't mean for things to go as far as they did." She broke down, sobbing, "Oh, William, if I could go back, I'd stop it right there. I'd never let this happen. You have to believe me." Hearing her confession left me stunned. All I could manage was, "This is shocking, Loren. I don't know what to say." She sat there quietly, head down, sniffling, before finally looking up. "William, is there any hope you could ever forgive me?" she asked softly. I took a steadying breath, trying not to sound too harsh. "Loren, is this the truth? The whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" She looked up at me, a mix of confusion and fear in her eyes, trying to gauge my reaction. Finally, after a tense pause, Loren looked up at me, her face pale, and whispered, "Yes, William, that's what happened. I'm so sorry." It felt like my heart was being ripped apart, but I kept my expression steady, forcing myself to hold back the pain and anger. I took a breath, stood up, and signaled for Samuel and Julian to return. Once they were back, I said firmly, "This meeting is over." With that, I headed toward the door but then stopped, turning back to face Loren one last time. "I'm filing for divorce on grounds of infidelity, and we're going to enforce the terms of our prenuptial agreement." Lauren's face went pale, and she reached out, her voice desperate. "But, William," I confessed, "I admitted I was unfaithful, and I'm begging you to forgive me. Please, let's try to save our marriage. I love you so much." I shook my head and replied, "Loren, you lied to me. If you'd been honest from the start, I might have considered working things out. But you didn't care enough to give us that chance. I warned you to come clean, but you chose to hide the truth. I know this wasn't just one incident with Marco. I have the evidence. And yet, you still chose to lie to my face." With that, I turned back to the door, opened it, and started to walk away. Lauren's voice broke as she cried out, "Wait, William, I'll tell you everything. Everything you want to know. Please, don't leave me." I turned around one last time, glaring at her with a mixture of hurt and anger. "You were warned, Loren. You had your chance, and you thought you could get away with only admitting to one affair. So you lied. It's over." Lauren's face crumpled, but I kept walking, slamming the door behind me. Samuel hurried to catch up with me as I was getting into my car. Grabbing my arm, he asked, "William, Are you sure you want to go through with this? To file on infidelity grounds. Yes, I replied without hesitation. She had her chance to come clean, and she couldn't even do that. I must have misjudged her all these years. Samuel nodded, and I told him, go ahead and file. I drove back home, now just my home, grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge, and sat down in my office. I downed the first beer quickly and nursed the second one, replaying everything that had happened. I had plenty of copies of the video evidence tucked away in secure spots, so I didn't think I'd ever need to make them public. With her confession on tape, I figured that was more than enough. Suddenly, my stomach dropped. I'd left the tape in Julian's office. I immediately grabbed my phone and called Samuel. Hey, it's William. Did you happen to grab the tape recording of Lauren's confession before you followed me out? There was a brief silence, and then Samuel sighed, Oh no, William. I didn't. I was focused on catching up with you and completely forgot. I'm really sorry. I clenched my jaw, frustrated at myself. I'd been meticulous with everything else, but in that moment of hurt and anger, I'd walked out without the tape. Damn it, I muttered. Samuel, can you call Julian and see if you can get it back? Though I'm guessing they'll claim they erased it. It's all right, I told Samuel. But honestly, I'll be surprised if you actually manage to get that tape back. Don't worry, though. Even if you can't, I've got more than enough evidence to file for infidelity. Samuel replied, All right, man. I know you didn't want to have to use the downloaded videos, but if she decides to contest the infidelity charge, you may not have a choice. Yeah, I know, I reassured him. It'll all work out, Samuel. Don't stress about it. I hung up, grabbed another beer from the fridge, and muttered to myself, Damn, how could I be so careless? I wasn't drunk, just numb. As the evening news droned in the background. After a while, I thought I heard a car pulling up outside. Slowly, I got up, walked over to the back door, and stepped out onto the porch. Just as I looked around, I caught sight of a shadowy figure in the yard. Before I could react, something hit me hard on the back of my head. A flash of white light filled my vision. Then everything faded into darkness. I woke to the steady sound of beeping and slowly opened my eyes, trying to take in my surroundings without moving too much. A nurse was seated beside me, and when I tried to turn my head, I realized I couldn't move. Hi, William, she said gently. I'm Chloe, your nurse. Please don't try to move just yet. You're safe, but you're still recovering, so it's best to stay still for now, all right? I felt an odd sensation in my throat and managed a slight nod. Chloe gave me a reassuring smile. I'll let the doctor know you're awake. We'll be back shortly. As I lay there, fragments of the incident began to return. I knew I'd been hurt, but the details were fuzzy. I closed my eyes, waiting, until I sensed someone re-entering the room. Mr. Turner or William, a new voice greeted softly. I'm Dr. Kate. You sustained several injuries from a beating during a home robbery. Now that you're awake, we're optimistic about your recovery, but we had to restrain you to prevent any sudden movements that might worsen your injuries. I'm sure you felt the pain when you tried to move. I managed a faint smile and nodded, feeling the soreness in my throat. Dr. Kate continued, We should have taken extra steps with the restraints to prevent that discomfort, and I'm sorry for any pain it caused. We'll remove the restraints now, but please try to avoid sudden movements, all right? I nodded again, gesturing toward the tube in my throat. Dr. Kate nodded back. We'll also remove the ventilator. Nurse Miller will take care of that. Once they removed the restraints and the ventilator, a sharp pain flared in my throat, making it difficult to speak. After a few minutes, they offered me a sip of water, which soothed my throat enough for me to whisper, Can someone please tell me what happened? Dr. Kate took a steady breath and explained, William, during a home robbery, you were seriously injured, but now that you're awake, we're hopeful for a full recovery. We had to restrain you to prevent further injury, and I apologize for any discomfort that caused. We'll remove the restraints and ventilator now, but please try to avoid any sudden movements as you begin to heal. It's 7 a.m., and you've just regained consciousness, Dr. Kate said softly. You've been taken off the ventilator, but your throat will be sore for a while, so for now, just focus on resting. Nurse Miller will stay with you, and once you've had some time to recover, We'll contact the police so they can come talk to you. They'll fill you in on the details of what happened." Dr. Kate continued, explaining my condition. "Medically, you have a few injuries. Fortunately, the EMTs arrived in time to revive you, and we managed to reinflate your lung. To put it plainly, you were assaulted. We'll keep monitoring you closely for the next few days, and if everything looks good, you should be ready to go home soon." The rest of the day passed in a haze of resting and pain with Nurse Miller, Chloe, by my side. By late afternoon, I was able to sit up with her help and even managed to shuffle to the restroom with significant assistance. During that time, Chloe and I chatted a bit, and I found out we'd actually gone to school together. She was a few years behind me back then, and I remembered her as Chloe Marlowe. She'd since married Brad Miller, and they had a 3-year-old daughter named Emily. She shared that, like Loren, Brad had been unfaithful, which had ultimately led to their divorce. When I told her what had been happening with Loren, she was sympathetic, nodding with a deep understanding I hadn't expected. The next morning, 2 detectives arrived early, Detective Raphael Douglas and Detective Marcus Barnes. After introducing themselves, they explained what had happened. Before they started questioning, I asked if they could tell me more about the attack itself. Detective Douglas began, "It looks like this started as a robbery and escalated into an assault. We found a 2x4 on the porch with traces of your hair and blood on it. There were no fingerprints, so we assumed the attacker wore gloves. We also didn't find any signs of forced entry since you were already on the porch with the door open." He continued, "Inside the house, several pictures had been removed from the walls, and a strong box in your desk drawer was emptied out. Every filing cabinet in the office was rifled through, and in the bedrooms, the drawers and closets had been searched. In the master bedroom, the jewelry box was also emptied. Clearly, there was a robbery, but it's hard to say exactly what was taken." Detective Barnes added, "When you're able to go back home, we'll need your help to assess what's missing. The doctor says it might be another 3 or 4 days before you can be discharged. Once you're home, we'll go through everything with you to update our records." Then Detective Douglas asked, "What do you remember about the attack?" "Not much," I admitted. "I'd had a couple of beers and was watching the evening news when I heard a vehicle pull into the yard. I got up to check what was going on, stepped onto the porch, and saw a shadowy figure just before everything went dark. I don't remember anything else until yesterday. I'm afraid I won't be much help in figuring out who did this." Detective Douglas nodded and replied, "That's all right. We just need to ask a few more questions to help with our investigation." Then he began asking about my background, trying to piece together any possible leads. The detective asked where my wife was during the attack, and I explained that we were separated and going through a divorce, so I wasn't sure of her whereabouts. He nodded, then asked if he could call me William, which I agreed to. From there, he wanted to know how the divorce was progressing and if there'd been any significant conflicts. I told him it wasn't exactly going smoothly since she was challenging the grounds for divorce. When he asked what grounds I was filing under, I explained I'd filed for infidelity, which would reduce her settlement significantly, and she was disputing it. The detective raised an eyebrow and remarked that this might give her a potential motive. "Detective, I just can't believe she'd ever do anything to hurt me," I said, trying to process what he was implying. He nodded and reassured me, saying they'd investigate it thoroughly. Then he asked if I could think of anyone else who might want to harm me. Neighbors, friends, family, anyone I'd had disputes with. I honestly couldn't think of anyone. He reminded me that once I was well enough to go home, we'd need to inventory any items that were missing, then asked if I had any cash in the house, maybe in the strongbox, and if so, how much. He also asked if I owned any high-value items like jewelry or artwork worth thousands of dollars. I told him there was some cash in the strongbox, about $8,000, as I usually keep around $100 in cash but had recently withdrawn more, so it was closer to $8,800. As for valuables, I had a few nice pieces of jewelry, but nothing worth over $1,000. I decided not to mention the hidden safe behind the bookcase, as he hadn't brought it up, and I wanted to keep that detail private if possible. Detective Douglas nodded, saying, "Well, William, that's all we need for today. If you think of anything else, please give me a call. When you're ready to return home, let us know so we can help with the inventory." He added that if they had more questions, They'd follow up at the hospital or at my home. Over the next 4 days, I focused on resting, taking plenty of naps, and talking with Chloe. I had a steady stream of visitors, including Max, Mia, Samuel, and Isabel. Loren didn't come to see me, and apart from Mia, none of her family did either. Given the circumstances, I understood, though I'd have welcomed the company. Julian, Lauren's attorney, and an old friend of mine, also stopped by, and I appreciated his visit despite everything going on. Everyone expressed sympathy for what had happened and wished me a smooth recovery. Both Mia and Isabel kissed me on the cheek before they left, and I saw tears in their eyes. It was a tough few days. Though I slept a lot, I had some disturbing dreams and would wake up panicked, with my heart racing and my eyes wet. Sometimes I'd wake up disoriented, unsure of where I was, but Chloe was always there to comfort me with gentle words and a calming hand. I was pretty sure I even woke myself up with a scream one night, though the details of my nightmares slipped away as soon as I opened my eyes. Later, I found out that Chloe had been staying at the hospital even when she was off duty, only leaving to freshen up and change clothes each day. She told me it was because she knew I was going through a lot with my marriage, and she wanted to be there to support me. I was genuinely grateful for her kindness. Eventually, Dr. Kate came in to let me know I'd be discharged soon. Relieved, I started getting ready, and Chloe helped me pack up my things. She even wheeled me down to the lobby, where Max and Mia were waiting to take me home. Chloe gave me a warm hug and wished me luck, clearly showing how much she cared. My life was a mess of marriage problems and recovery, so I didn't pursue anything further. I mentioned I'd like to call her sometime in the future, and she smiled, leaving it at that. When I walked into my house, I was hit by the overwhelming mess left behind from the robbery. Max and Mia offered to help me clean up, but I told them I wanted to go through everything first, just as it was. They reluctantly agreed and left me alone, promising to come back whenever I needed help. The first thing I did was head straight to the hidden safe behind the bookcase in my office. To my relief, everything inside was untouched. Cash, certificates of deposit, stocks, bonds, and, most importantly, the DVD with evidence of Lauren's infidelity. It was clear no one had discovered the safe. I inspected the rest of the office and found that, aside from the cash, my laptop, and a few prints by wildlife artist Larry Winslow, nothing else seemed to be missing. However, someone had left my bank and credit card statements spread out on the desk, so I immediately called both the bank and my credit card companies, asking them to monitor for any unusual activity over the next few weeks. As the days went by, the police investigation into the robbery and assault seemed to move at a crawl, mostly due to a lack of solid evidence. Detectives Douglas and Barnes kept me updated, but without any new leads, the case started to stall. They explained that, since none of my high-value items had been stolen, it was tough to narrow down suspects. During their last update, they even hinted that the case might be put on hold unless new evidence surfaced. Early on, the detectives had asked me questions about Loren and our relationship. I'd been honest, telling them that, despite the divorce, I didn't believe she'd ever want to harm me. Besides, taking items she would likely receive in the divorce didn't make sense. The detectives seemed to agree. Their inquiries into Loren hadn't led to anything substantial. To protect myself further, I opened new bank accounts and ordered fresh checks. Feeling a bit more secure with these precautions, I also purchased a new laptop and reorganized my office, taking the first steps toward getting my life back on track. As I got back into my routine and tackled some overdue bills, an invoice from a company called Red Incorporated caught my eye. Suddenly, I remembered that Red stood for Remote Electronic Data Storage Solutions. I had video surveillance covering my property, including the house, grain bins, and machine shed, with the footage backed up nightly to Red's servers. Normally, I deleted the oldest data each month to manage storage fees, but I hadn't deleted anything since the robbery. It hit me, I might have video evidence of the incident. Without hesitation, I logged into Red's website, found the day of the robbery in their archives, and downloaded the entire day's footage to my laptop. My hope was that the video quality would be good enough to identify the culprits. If it was, I planned to burn a DVD copy for Detectives Douglas and Barnes to revive their investigation. But as I reviewed the footage, it quickly became clear that nothing useful for the detectives was captured. I just have to accept that the case might remain unsolved. After handling my bills, I began thinking about my future. I decided to reach out to an old college friend who worked at Cargill, one of the largest grain merchandisers in the country. Thanks to that connection, I soon arranged a meeting with some decision-makers in their acquisitions department. It was remarkable how a personal connection could open doors. Within 2 weeks, I'd finalized some promising plans with Cargill and even took a quick trip to Las Vegas. Afterward, I flew to Phoenix for business and then returned home to put everything into motion. I contacted Samuel and asked him to arrange a meeting with Loren, her brothers Will and Evan, and her sister Mia at Gentry Grain. I had him mention that with the impending divorce, they might face challenges with the state's grain reserves if they could no longer use my grain storage. The message seemed to surprise them, but they readily agreed to meet. It was clear they hadn't fully considered the impact of losing access to my storage facilities. When I walked into the office, I greeted them all. "Hello, Will, Evan, Mia, Loren. I assume you understand why I wanted us to sit down and resolve some things." Will started to speak, but I raised my hand. "I initiated this meeting, so I suggest you hear me out before making any comments. I genuinely believe it's in everyone's best interest." I addressed the divorce first, looking directly at Loren. "I apologize, Loren," I said, placing the final draft of the divorce papers on the table in front of her. "Please sign these." Loren's face fell, and she said, "William, I don't want a divorce. Whatever you think I did, it's not worth throwing away all the good years we've shared. I wish you could forgive me and work through our problems." "I don't want to do this in front of my brothers and sister," Loren said. But I shook my head. "Loren, we're concluding this now," I replied. "There's no future for our marriage, and the sooner you sign these papers, the sooner we can both move forward." Her face flushed, and she muttered, "Well, if you insist on divorcing me, I still plan to contest the infidelity issue. It's the least you can do for me." I'd expected her to play that card and was ready. "If you challenge me on this, Loren, I'll have no choice but to use this DVD as evidence in court." I placed a copy of the DVD on the table beside the divorce papers. "In case you're wondering, this contains footage of all 8 times you cheated on me at the spa." Mia's face turned bright red as she glared at Loren in shock and disappointment. "It's true," I said, nodding. "Loren had affairs with both Marco and Bradley. I have 8 videos of her with them, which should settle any question of infidelity." I looked Loren directly in the eye and gave her an ultimatum. "Sign the divorce papers now, or prepare for a full court proceeding. I'm done playing games." Will and Evan were visibly stunned, while Mia silently wiped away tears. After a long pause, Lauren's shoulders slumped, and she picked up the pen to sign. She left her copy of the papers on the table, and I slipped the rest into my briefcase. She looked numb, her eyes wet with unshed tears, clearly shaken by the evidence I'd gathered. With the divorce settled, I shifted the discussion to the grain situation. I addressed the group, acknowledging their shock but assuring them I'd be brief. "Because of the divorce, I'll no longer be including my stored grain in your reserves, which puts you out of compliance with your grain license and loan agreements. However, there's another development. I've purchased your father's 52% share of the business. Since the original agreement didn't include a right of first refusal, it was a straightforward purchase. He understood the company's need for my equity and trusted the evidence of Loren's infidelity, making his decision easier. As it stands, I'm now the majority shareholder in Gentry Grain Incorporated. While each of you retains a 12% share, totaling a minority 48%, I paused to let this sink in, then continued. I've negotiated a deal to sell my controlling interest in Gentry Grain to Cargill, who's actively seeking promising grain operations. You'll each have the option to sell your shares at the same favorable price I secured. The downside is that ownership now rests with someone else, and the new management will review personnel contributions. The upside is that, as part of my negotiations, each of you has a 1-year job guarantee. Use that time to show your worth. I wrapped up by disclosing that I'd also sold both my farm and Max's farm to Cargill, with Max taking on a long-term contract to manage them. Their shock only deepened, now tinged with anger. Ted, the eldest and unofficial leader of the Gentry family, was the first to speak up. "What on earth have you done, William? You've destroyed this family business just because my sister cheated on you. What kind of man does that? And how did you even convince my father to sell his shares to you? What lies did you feed him?" "Let me clarify, Ted," I replied calmly. "Your father sold me his shares to protect you, Evan, and Loren from legal trouble. Instead of questioning what kind of man I am, maybe you should be asking yourself what kind of people your siblings are." I placed a second DVD in the middle of the table. This video will answer all your questions about why this is happening. It shows, without a doubt, your pickup truck in my yard on the night I was attacked. It captures both you and Evan assaulting me and leaving my house with my belongings. Consider yourselves lucky that I chose this path instead of handing it over to Detectives Douglas and Barnes. At that, Loren finally spoke up, voicing her dismay at my actions. I turned to her, feeling years of resentment boil over. "Our situation is different, Loren. I feel like I wasted my life with you. Your family has always treated me poorly, and you never missed a chance to act superior to me. You were supposed to be my best friend, but instead you were a deceitful partner. You promised me loyalty, only to turn around and sleep with Louis Fairbanks. You broke your vows, disrespected our marriage, and cheated with multiple men. I saw everything on those videos, heard every word. You nearly killed me with that attack. That's the friend you turned out to be." Lauren's face went pale, and she fainted. Mia and Evan rushed to her side, managing to catch her before she hit the floor. When she regained consciousness, I delivered the final blow. "Your father sold me his shares to keep the three of you out of jail. He wasn't proud of his children, except for Mia, and that's something she'll come to understand later. I may have wasted years of my life on you, Loren, but I'm not wasting a single minute more on my future with any of you. I wish you all the best." With that, I walked out, leaving the negotiations behind. I felt liberated, and for the first time in years, I was ready to move forward with my life. And that's exactly what I intended to do.